Welcome to the reading of the Spirit's book. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the introduction, so we thought it would be valuable to also touch on how Kardec introduced the Spirit's book. He spends about 40 pages and 17 parts explaining what the Spirit's book is. And we'll try to give here a small summary, or at least a few takeouts which we found valuable. Starting part 1, he starts with definitions. So he goes like that. When new matters arise, new words are needed for the sake of clarity of language, in order to avoid the confusion inherent in multiple meanings for the same terms. For example, the words spiritual, spiritualist, spiritualism, each have a well-defined meaning. Being a scientist and somebody who takes methodology very seriously, Kardec took the time to think definitions before he approached the book. So he explains that spiritualism is a very broad term. So spiritualism he describes as everything that's the opposite to materialism. So everything that believes in something beyond matter, spiritualism, therefore a very broad term. And he says, therefore, instead of the word spiritual and spiritualism for designating this latter belief, we have coined and employed the words spiritist and spiritism. These two terms reflect their origin in their fundamental meaning, and they thus have the advantage of being perfectly understandable. We will leave spiritualism to its own meaning, because it's broad. Hence, we will say that the principle of the Spiritist doctrine, or Spiritism, is based on the relationship between the material world and the invisible world, the latter being inhabited by beings known as spirits. The adherents of Spiritism will be called Spiritists. In a specialized sense, the Spirit's book contains the Spiritist doctrine, and we talked before that we will not use the word doctrine very much because, currently it could be something that is imposed. We'll use the word philosophy, and Kardec uses both. In a generalized sense, it is linked to spiritualism and represents one aspect of it. So that is why we have inscribed the words on the title page, spiritualistic philosophy. So basically he explains that spiritualism is a very broad term, and spiritism is the science, is the study of the spirits, so it's the philosophy of the spirits. So he starts with that. It's part number 1. Part number 2, he goes beyond a little bit on the definitions, and then he talks about soul, right? So if we study spirits, what are those spirits? Let's go into definitions as well. The same thing. So he also found that soul could be described in different ways. So one aspect could be the principle of material organic life. It has no existence of its own, and at that it ceases to exist. That's one definition. Then another one is the principle of intelligence, the universal agents of which each being absorbs a portion. And finally, the soul is a moral being distinct from and independent of matter, and which retains its individuality after death. So in any case, he explains here that the soul is a cause and not an effect. So is the basis for spirituality is believing that we are actually souls and not, matter, beyond matter. And then he goes to explain what definition he will use. So choosing this or that definition would not matter, since it is simply a matter of convention. The important thing is clarity. So he explains why he wants to make some things clear, because he wants to be pretty precise when he's describing or defining something. We think that the most logical to take it in its commonest meaning, and we thus use soul to indicate the immaterial and individual being that dwells within and survives the body. Again, he says the soul is the immaterial individual being that dwells with and survives the body. Right? So this is the definition of the soul. Now, talking about, remember the first two explanations were the, either organic principle or intelligent principle. Then he goes on to say, well, we need to find a term for the other two meanings, right? And then he explains what is the vital principle as the material and organic life principle, whatever its source may be, which is common to all living creatures, from plants to humans. So vital principle is what enables species to move and act. And he says that is found in a special universally diffused fluid. Each being absorbs and assimilates a portion of this fluid. So it is, so the vital principle will manifest then. Throughout its life, much of its inner bodies absorb, as inner bodies absorb light. So he talks about how the vital principle becomes then absorbed. We absorb parts of it to manifest life, just as inert bodies absorb light. This substance is called the vital fluid. So he introduces then another definition. So there's the vital principle, which is the source, and then there's the vital fluid, which is the manifestation of the source. And it's different in each life form. He says the same thing as an animalized electric energy, also designated as magnetic fluid, neurofluid, and so on and so forth. In chapter 4 of this book, he's going to get into a lot more details. He's just taking the time to say, well, what is the soul? That which survives the body. And the vital principle is that which gives life to material and organic life principle. Then he talks about the fluid. Here he says another couple of things that we think is important to highlight. There's one incontestable fact for its results and observations, and that is that organic beings possess an inner force that produces the phenomenon of life as long as this force exists. That physical life is common to all organic beings and is independent of intelligence and thought. That intelligence and thought are faculties peculiar to certain organic species. And lastly, that among the organic species endowed with intelligence and thought, there's one that is endowed with a special moral sense that gives it incontestable ascendancy over the others, the human species. So life manifests in different ways, and we all have our specific fluids of that manifestation, and the intelligence is separate because is the intelligent being that's behind it, and he talks about human species being different than the others by having this special moral sense. So we could look, if we pause here for a second, to talk about this vital principle. So there's a principle, and we will talk about that a little bit in the other chapters, and we talked about chapter 4. So that principle is life manifestation. Life will manifest differently in every living species. In our sense, we have this vital fluid, so it is what gives life to our bodies, for example. So if you want to use an analogy, let's say the spirit would be the driver, the car would be the body, which is being manifested through the spirit, through the intelligence, and the fuel would be this vital fluid. Right? So the vital fluid is what makes the car move, without which the car cannot move, even if an intelligence is asking it to. Once we run out of this fluid, we die. When we do, when our soul will leave, or the spirit will leave this body, the body will decompose because there's no life. You will not be able to manifest without that. So he takes the time to talk about these definitions in here, and we'll see that it will come back in the book. He's just trying to make clear which words he used and why. And here in the end of the second part, he says, the Spiritist doctrine naturally rests on the existence within us of a being independent of matter. This being survives the body at death. Since the word soul is repeated frequently throughout this work, we have thus had to define the meaning we attach to it in order to avoid any misunderstanding. So this is the second part. So we just read part 1 and 2, which are the definitions of the introduction. That's our reading for today. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.